The great question of ethics is what is good for such an agent as ourselves? And to say that it's virtue might seem simply a kind of pious remark at first, but of course now we, having followed this analysis, this function analysis, as we're calling it, that we find in Aristotle, and we see how it complements, though it's not identical, with the distinction that Thomas made between human acts and the acts of man, we're able to see that virtue is simply performing well a certain function. It's the excellence of the function, or the arete. So it follows as night the day that the acquisition of virtue is the acquisition of the capacity to perform good acts, and it is that then in virtue of which thanks to which we are going to be called good. But there are many of them. There are many of them, and that raises the question: how many of them do we have to have in order to be a good person? Or is it sufficient just to have one and say, well, I'm good because I have this virtue. It's the perfection of rational activity. Rational activity is the characteristic activity of a human being, ergo, etc. I'm a nice guy. Huh? Well, as we know, that isn't going to be sufficient, and particularly as in the case that I was hinting at a moment ago, where we think of someone who has a great deal of knowledge, that knowledge can be put to a very sometimes damaging purpose by such a one. Just imagine if we found that a scientist comes out of his laboratory, face aglow, hair all mussed up and so forth, and with burning gaze tells us, I've found a cure for cancer. Well, we're delighted, and we're sure he's going to get the Nobel Prize and so on, and we go into his lab with him and to get further information about this great discovery, and we hear kind of snuffling and snarling and edgy action around us, and we realize that the lab is filled with cages, and we look in them and there are people in them. Huh? And we realize that this man has been using human subjects as lab animals. And now we begin to alter our view about this fellow. We were so proud of him and congratulating him and so forth, and now we're really appalled by what he has done. So the question then arises is he less of a scientist for having degraded human beings in the way in which he has, or is this some defect beyond scientific knowledge as such? A complicated subject, but it is possible for us to say that somebody could be a good geometer and a bad man. Somebody could be a good scientist and a bad man. So that the virtues, thanks to which one is a good scientist, and by that, what do we mean? Excellence in the use of his mind as bearing upon certain objects of pursuit or inquiry. That's what we mean by an intellectual virtue. So anyone who is a scientist, who has a habit of knowledge in a particular area, geometry, microbiology, whatever, astronomy, would have an intellectual virtue. And yet, what the example, the somewhat far-fetched example, let's hope, that I've just put before you would indicate is that that virtue is compatible with bad choices, bad decisions, bad moral action. So what we begin to discern is this, that unless these intellectual virtues are part of a good life, that is, unless they are not only skills acquired but are directed to the overall good of the human being, which again we realize is not just the good of that individual as an individual, then this is an immoral use of the knowledge. But this needn't lead us to deny that the person has the knowledge and has the intellectual virtues. So some virtues clearly are not anywhere near sufficient for us saying of someone that he is a good man. There we would tend to qualify it, say he's a good scientist or he's a good geometer, just as we would say he's a good golfer or a good cameraman. But that doesn't lead to our saying, therefore he is a good man without qualification. What makes one to be a good person without qualification that is in the full and absolute sense is if one's will is oriented to the true good of the human being. And that is something that is assured to the degree that it can be assured in this life by habits which direct appetite to follow the guidance of reason, practical reason, as to the good